Hey guys, welcome back to TSI. I'm Dave, thanks for watching. So this is another car vlog video, and I wanted to talk to you today about the M1 Garand. Now I didn't really want to go into the M1 Garand's history or its function or how to use it or what not to do with it. Maybe I'll cover that a little bit, but this is mostly a personal story about why I own a Garand rifle and why the gun has some sort of significance to me. Now, I originally purchased the Garand in October of last year, so almost a year ago today, or almost a year ago around this time. I went to Pennsylvania and I bought it. The Eagle Arms gun show was really cool. It's one of the first gun shows I ever went to. It was just a lot of shit. And then for a band state guy like me, you see all that cool stuff hanging around, you just get really, really excited. So I bought the Garand for really one reason. It's because every time I hold that gun, I feel a lot closer to my grandfather, who unfortunately is no longer with us. To me, the gun started off as a practical purchase, but as time has gone on, the reasons for owning the Garand have become almost more emotional than practical. Now, this is not to say that the Garand is a bad gun to own for practical use, for defensive use. I sort of question a little bit if you choose the Garand as your main weapon, but you could definitely do worse. For me, though, it tells a story of one man and our mutual connection, and that is that we both have handled the same rifle. We both have shot it. So I'm going to get a little bit personal in this video. I apologize if it's a little bit too personal, but it's just something that needs to be said and something I want to discuss because it's been on my mind. So my grandfather, his name was Ralph. He was descended from Italian immigrants. His father was actually from Italy. There's actually a picture that exists of his father in some kind of a uniform. We think that in our family that my great-grandfather, Ralph's father, might have actually participated in the First World War on the Italian side, meaning that he fought for the Italian army, which is really, really funny because my other great-grandfather, my grandmother, my paternal great-grandfather, that makes sense, the father of my grandmother on my father's side, and it gets a little bit complicated, but he actually fought for the United States during World War I. So there's a part of me that kind of thinks, well, wouldn't it be kind of funny if they met each other on the field of battle and a couple of decades later they would have a common descendant, which is me. It's the story of America in a nutshell, though, and it really is pretty beautiful how stuff like that can happen. A nation of immigration and a nation of melting together. But I digress. My grandfather was born in Brooklyn, Queens, in the 1930s. He was born in about 36, although I can't remember the exact year. Sometimes I think it's 38, sometimes it's 36. I don't remember the exact year, and I apologize. He is my grandfather. I don't know the specific date. But he was definitely born before World War II. He was too young to serve in the Second World War. He was about in his teens when World War II ended. But my grandfather and his father didn't really get along very well. Now, the rumor goes that around my family that my great-grandfather forced Ralph's mother to have an abortion, which actually failed and killed her. And my grandfather never quite forgave his father for that. And years later, my great-grandfather remarried, and my grandpa hated his stepmother, absolutely hated her. And I don't know the reason why. I heard that she was just a very vindictive person, and, you know, insert reason here. It's sort of lost to history, but he hated her so much growing up that he decided when he came of age he was going to join the U.S. Marine Corps. And that's what he did to escape. He wanted to get away. So he joined the U.S. Marine Corps in the late 40s and became a U.S. Marine and was stationed in Guam for a short time. Then when the Korean War broke out in the 1950s, he was sent there. Now this is where the history gets a little bit hazy. My grandfather claimed that he was a medic during that conflict. However, based on the awards that we did research on him, that we found of him, it leads us to believe that he was not a medic. He just was so hurt and so traumatized by his time in the conflict, he probably preferred not to remember what he had to do. And the truth of the matter is, I don't specifically know if my grandfather ever was engaged in combat. I don't know that for a fact. Although around the family, there's a thing that was said that when my great uncle, my grandfather's brother, Vincent, or Bob, or I can't remember his name. See, I just wish I knew some of this stuff. I'll have to clarify with other people. But his brother was very, very ill, and my grandfather confided in him about what he did during the war, and he may have saw action. But when he and I interacted, he never mentioned anything about that. He was extremely proud about being a U.S. Marine, but he never liked to talk about the war, which I can understand. You know, it was his whole thing, and he didn't. I wouldn't say that. I think he was proud of his service, but he just didn't like what he had to do. Like a lot of veterans feel that way. You know, there's some traumatic shit that you don't want to talk about. Anyway, though, I only knew my grandfather when he was older, when he was in his 60s, when I was born, and he was a really, really just a wonderful man to me. He was the sweetest dude in the world. Although I heard when he was younger, because eventually became a Marine drill sergeant, he was kind of hard on his kids, but always well-meaning. He had 6 children, including my mother. And I just have wonderful, wonderful memories of him. I can remember some of the earliest things I remember of him. It's a funny story, number one, and other things are funny too. More warm, I guess. One of the first memories I can remember of my grandfather is that my mom had this really old Toyota, and she parked it in my grandfather's driveway, and I disengaged the parking brake because I didn't know what it was. And my grandpa saw it, and he held it up. He just just held it like that. He's like, guys, you need to re-engage the parking brake. And he's just standing there. I remember him just kind of like nonchalantly holding this car back. It was kind of funny. I guess you had to be there, but the next thing I remember is that he and I would actually watch a lot of the old Max Fleischer Superman cartoons from the 1940s and World War II. We would watch those a lot, and I loved Superman growing up. I still do. He's my favorite superhero. And we'd watch them, and I must have made him watch it like a million times. But my grandfather, he didn't care. He just wanted to spend time with his grandson. Other things about him is that what he would do with all his grandchildren, not just me, but I remember it because I thought it was really funny. What he used to do is he used to hide dollar bills all over the house, and when you came in, you would actually look for the dollar bill, and he would always put them in different locations. Sometimes what he would do is, if you were sitting down watching TV, he'd drop it on you. Or I remember one time actually I was eating, and there was a plate on a clear plastic plate on the table, and he actually put the dollar in there. And I looked at it, and I'm like, "What is this, Grandpa?" And he's like, "It's yours." And he always took joy in doing that. He loved doing that. I don't know where that habit originated from, but it's something I always remembered about him. And it's some of the fondest memories I ever had. Now, as time went on, my grandfather developed dementia and Alzheimer's, or closer to Alzheimer's rather, and his mind began to fade. And I regret that, or rather I feel very strongly about what happened, because when he began to show symptoms of that, I was a young man. I was in my early teens. And I knew him. I remember him. I'm so happy that I remember him, but I wish I could have been an adult to know him. I wish I could have talked to him as an adult, not as a child, because when he began to lose his cognitive abilities, I was a teenager. And you know how it is. When you're a teenager, you're different than you're an adult. You want to talk to him as a man, as a full-grown adult. And I would have loved to have conversations with him with regard to that. A couple of years ago, he died. He died in 2011, so a couple of years before the filming of this video. And the only thing I can say about him is that I miss him greatly. And when I saw the Garand, I realized that, no, I don't know my grandfather's actual service record. I don't know what he did in the war specifically, but I know that during that time period, he must have interacted with that weapon, either in basic, most likely in basic. He either fired it, I know he fired it, he must have been familiar with that particular gun. And in that sense, I feel closer to him. I feel that there's a common link between us, that, you know, despite the fact that he's now gone, every time I pick that gun up, I feel like my grandpa's there, and I can still remember, him, hugging me or talking to me or just doing the stuff that he used to do. I remember, I remember the last thing he said to me before he started getting really, really bad. We were in the nursing home together, and I was wheeling him around, and he was saying hi to the nurses and everything like that, just like he did. He was kind of a ham, and he said, he said to me, "David," I said, "What?" He said, "I love you," and he said that maybe 5 or 6 times, and he kept saying it and saying it, and I wasn't sure. Of course, I said, "I love you too, Grandpa," and I wasn't sure, why he was saying it so much, but just like people say when Alzheimer's and dementia, it really is the long goodbye, and that might have been his way of saying goodbye. You can tell I get a little bit emotional when I talk about this, but, it has to be said. Sometimes in the gun culture, a gun is more than just a defensive tool, It represents something emotional, or a relative you lost. And you'll never get the person back, but at least when you have that, you can, I'm sorry. At least when you have that, there's some kind of connection there. There's some physical presence left. And in that sense, I'll never be fully away from my grandfather. And the reason why I was so enthusiastic about it is because, or the reason why I talk about my grandfather so much to the people who know me, is because my dad's father, I never met him. He died about 10 years before I was born. And because I only had one grandfather, I really put all my emotional stock into that person. But also on another level, my grandfather was really the opposite of me in so many ways. He was, compared to me, I was like this scrawny, well, not really scrawny, but I was just kind of like this awkward, nerdy kid, and my grandfather was this big, manly man, Marine, built his house, was very good with his hands and power tools and everything like that. He was like everything masculine that a man could ever want to be, and he was my grandfather. And despite the fact that I wasn't like him in a lot of ways, but he didn't care, he liked me for who I was, and he loved me for who I was. And to have someone like that in your life is very important. God, I'm so sorry. It's hard to talk about sometimes, but like I said, I was going to get personal. I knew it was going to end up being that way. But yeah, that's why I have the Garand, because it reminds me of him. It's a kick-ass gun too, by the way. It's just it's easy to shoot and whatnot, but as you can tell, like, I get emotional whenever I talk about it. But it's nice, though. It's nice to speak about these kind of things. And as I said, going back to that point, he was everything that I wasn't, and everything that I wanted to be. This epitome of masculinity, Marine Corps, just like a really handy dude. He was a big dude too. He was much taller than me. He was about 6'2". And he treated me like gold. When people around me, as a kid, I was never fit in really quite that well. And it was good to have that kind of role model in your life. It really was. And I do miss him greatly. And I guess if anything else, I'll say that when a relative has Alzheimer's, it really is the long goodbye. And people who have experienced this know what it's like. I remember the last time that I saw him after that whole thing. It was a couple of months before he died. I was in the nursing home, and at this point he had lost most of his cognitive ability. But when he looked at me, you could tell that he knew who I was, but couldn't articulate it. And there was like this emotion in his eyes. It's so hard to describe, but you looked into his eyes and you could see into his soul, and he knew he wanted to say something to me, but he couldn't, because it was the disease had taken him away. God, I'm sorry, but it's just hard to talk about sometimes. Anyways, guys, let me collect myself. This is Dave with TSI. Have a good one.